Good day. I'm going to continue my practice over the Christmas bank holiday, or holidays as we call them in Britain, of providing short video updates about topical issues in terms of international relations. And it is the geopolitical conflict, the major conflict between Russia and the Western powers that, of course, continues to dominate, and which is the issue in terms of international relations which dominates the headlines. I should stress that it is not the only issue, or perhaps even the most dangerous one. There is, as I've discussed in a recent program, increasing indications that the talks between the United States and Iran over a return to the JCPOA are close to total breakdown, and there is a serious possibility that the United States and Israel could respond to such a breakdown by launching military strikes against Iran, something which, in my opinion, could very easily evolve into a series of escalatory counter-reactions by the Iranians, which might lead to all sorts of problems in the Middle East, such as we can only imagine. And then, of course, there is the much greater geopolitical conflict, the one between China and the United States. Now, a few weeks ago, a few months ago, that was the major topic of discussion in my programs. I spoke about the Chinese moves in and around Taiwan, the fact that the Chinese have made clear their various red lines over Taiwan. Xi Jinping actually spelled them out in the virtual summit meeting he had with President Biden a few weeks ago. And the build-up of Chinese military power and the growing tensions in the Indo-Pacific, well, that hasn't changed in the slightest. The situation there continues to slide. Tensions between the United States and China remain high, but of course, because of the interest and concern about the situation in Ukraine, international attention has drained away from that issue. So it is, I suspect, partly something that the Chinese would appreciate. I think they would prefer to have the focus of world attention on the situation in Ukraine rather than that on the Taiwan Straits. After all, the Chinese believe that time is on their side, but the fact is that crisis remains, it endures, it deteriorates, and there's little sign that the United States has a coherent response to it. But as I said, it is the crisis in Ukraine, the crisis in Eastern Europe, the new Russian proposals which have been made to NATO and to the Western powers. It is those which are attracting attention. And over the next few days, over the next week, in fact, we're going to have apparently direct negotiations between the Americans and the Russians about Russia's security proposals. And it seems that we are also going to have a meeting between NATO and Russia within the format of the widely discredited and ineffectual NATO-Russia Council. But anyway, those negotiations are currently about to happen, though we don't yet know what the US negotiating position is going to be. The United States has been extremely unwilling to spell out its negotiation position clearly in advance of the talks. And I'm going to touch on this program about what the Russians, who of course, by contrast, have spelled out their negotiating position in great detail, what they're saying, and I'm going to look at the kind of steps the Russians may be taking over the course of those negotiations, and especially if they feel that the negotiations are not progressing in the way that they want them to. Before I do that, I suppose I must discuss the situation within Ukraine itself. And it turns out that President Zelensky of Ukraine has once again put forward what he calls a 10-step peace plan to resolve the crisis in Ukraine. The essential point about this particular peace plan is that it requires direct talks between Zelensky and Putin, in other words, between Russia and Ukraine, supposedly to solve the crisis. It seeks to disregard or ignore the leaders of the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, even though Ukraine is committed to negotiating with those leaders under the terms of the Minsk Agreement, which Ukraine repeatedly says it will abide by. Anyway, the Russians have already rejected this so-called peace plan that Zelensky has put forward. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, said that it was not 10 steps forward, it was 10 steps back. It was, in effect, another attempt to evade Ukraine's commitments under the Minsk Agreement, which require direct talks between Ukraine and the two breakaway republics of the Donbass. So the Russians have rejected this peace plan in short order. I would add that it seems a little bizarre that the Ukrainians or Zelensky are talking about a peace plan when there is already a peace plan in existence, which is, of course, the peace plan outlined in the 2015 Minsk Agreement, and which they say they are committed to, but which they are not complying with. It seems most odd that the Ukrainians are seeking to, if you like, reinvent the wheel by offering an alternative peace plan to one which they still say they are committed to. And of course, the Russians are perfectly right in saying that the Ukrainians offering this peace plan, this alternative peace plan, means that in reality, even if not so far rhetorically, they are going back on or rejecting the actual peace plan that they are committed to, the Minsk Agreement, which requires them to engage in direct talks with the leaders of the two republics in the Donbass, the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Anyway, so much for that. Let me now get on to the substance of this discussion, what the Russians might do if the negotiations don't go anywhere further, or at least the negotiations between Russia and the United States get bogged down, if the United States fails to clarify its position, if it tries to string the Russians along with the talks, with those talks. But before I do so, I think I want to reiterate a point which I've made already in passing in various programs, but which I think bears restating perhaps more than once, which is that, of course, the United States and the Western powers are going to try to limit these discussions to the extent that they can into a discussion about Ukraine, but that the Russians have made it very clear that the negotiations they are seeking with the West are not specifically about Ukraine itself. They are about something different, though one which does touch on the problem of Ukraine. That is, what they're about is the eastward expansion of NATO. The Russian proposals are about bringing this process of NATO's eastward expansion to a stop and ultimately seeking its reversal by having all the infrastructure, all the military units which have been stationed in Eastern Europe, that infrastructure dismantled and those military units withdrawn, in effect bringing the situation back in military terms in Europe to what it was back in 1997 before the process of NATO expansion got underway. Now, I say that because it's important to understand that the conflict in Ukraine, which the Russians insist is an internal conflict, and the larger question of NATO's eastward expansion are two discrete and separate issues. Obviously, as I said, the one touches on the other, but they should not be confused. If the Western powers come along to these talks and try to confine them to a debate about Ukraine, what they're going to find is that the Russians will regard that as a refusal to engage with them, and that will provoke Russian counter reactions, which I will come to in a moment. Now, having said all of that, and touching on the question of Ukraine, it is important to say that the reason this situation has arisen with such urgency now, the question of NATO's eastern expansion has arisen with such urgency now, is because from a Russian point of view, they are now in a position to do something about Ukraine's drift towards NATO. This drift has been underway ever since the 2014 Maidan uprising and coup, or revolution if you prefer, in Ukraine in 2014. But until now, the Russians have not been in a position to do anything to prevent it, or at least they haven't been willing to go to the point of saying that for them, Ukraine's entry into NATO is a red line. They've said it at various places in private. They've talked about how they oppose it privately. But this year, in 2021, they finally came out and said that for them, it is a red line. And it's important to stress, again, a point I've made in my previous programs, that this is because of the shift in the balance of power, the correlation of forces, as the Russians like to say. They now feel that they can set out their red lines clearly, and the West has no option but to accept them, however grudgingly. And that has put the Russians in a position where they're not only able to insist on red lines and threaten military action if those red lines are broken, but they're also using that fact, the fact of the West's grudging acceptance of those red lines, to move forward to that other position of saying, yes, we oppose Ukrainian membership of NATO. That is for us a red line. But now, having said that, we're in a position to go further still, and we want commitments, definite long-term commitments from the Western powers, that the process of NATO's eastward expansion altogether must end. And in recent statements, the Russians have hinted that they want to see NATO eastward expansion end not just in respect of Ukraine, but in respect of countries in the Western Balkans, and also, by the way, Sweden and Finland also. This is a drastic new series of demands which the Russians are making now. Now, I have to say that when we look at this situation, which, as I said, has happened because of the change in the balance of power, something which we're going to come to shortly, it's important to say that the Russians and the Americans come to these negotiations with somewhat different perspectives and with somewhat different rhetorical stances. If you look at what the Russians talk about, they talk in terms of power and security. So they look at problems in Europe. When they talk about problems in Europe, They talk about the relative power of countries. They talk about the need for security for countries, first and foremost, of course, their own country, which is Russia. The United States, by contrast, doesn't like to talk about security and power. It engages, at least rhetorically, instead in talk about honor and values. Different type of position, one which takes dogmatic positions like Ukraine has a right to join NATO and we can't retreat from that because we are somehow honor bound to accept any country into NATO that wants to join, and it's purely a question for us and them to decide, and no one else has a right to a view on this, certainly not the Russians. So the Russians talk with tough realism about security and power, and the Americans talk, as I said, in a much more ideological way about honor and values. Now, I would quickly say that from a Russian point of view, they of course don't take any of this talk from the Americans about honor and values at all seriously. And this is where the Russian reminders of the various promises the Soviet Union and then Russia was given at the time when the USSR itself dissolved and when the Soviet Union agreed to the unification of Germany. This is why the Russians bring up all those promises, all those verbal promises, which they were given back in, at that time, in 1989 to 1991, about the fact that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. And the point they're making to the Americans is, you come up to us, you talk about honor, you talk about values, but your previous dealings with us shows that these great words actually don't mean anything. People who say that this Russian harping about those promises which they were given back in 1989 to 1991 about the eastward expansion of NATO, that this is somehow unimportant and that the Russians are in effect flogging a dead horse, I think they are profoundly wrong, because the Russians bringing up this topic, pointing out repeatedly to the Americans that when the Americans talk about honor and values, they are in fact inconsistent, because in the past they have acted towards the Soviet Union, towards Russia, without any feelings of honor or obligation. When the Russians bring that up, they are in effect pointing to the unreality, the phony nature, if you like, of the US negotiating stance. And you can see that in the difficulties that the US is having on this precise topic. You can see that, for example, in some of the comments made by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He is continuing with that utterly discredited claim that no promise was made to the Soviets and then to the Russians in the period between 1989 and 1991 that NATO would not expand eastwards. He's actually said in public that the story of that the promise that no one ever promised that NATO would not expand east. Stoltenberg must know that this is not true, and he must know that documents that have been declassified, by the way, in the United States, but also in Russia, which detail what happened during the negotiation, and actual witnesses of those discussions, like the then US ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, that all that evidence completely contradicts and discredits what he is saying. But he has to persist with this nonsense about the fact that the promise was never given, because admitting that it was undermines this stance about honour and values with which the United States and NATO seek to approach these discussions, because, of course, if they admitted to the truth, they would be conceding the Russian point that, in fact, that whole negotiating stance is a phony one. So, what exactly are the Americans trying to do in this negotiation? Well, I think they don't actually know. At some level, they don't want war in Europe. This has now become absolutely clear. The United States has made it very clear officially that it is not going to fight Russia in Ukraine. There's no question of deploying US forces to Ukraine. Britain's defense minister, Ben Wallace, has said the same thing. There's recently been an opinion poll in the United States about this, and it sets out the feelings of most American people, or at least of American people about this. And it's a poll, an opinion poll conducted by YouGov in conjunction with the Charles Koch Institute, and it was released about a week ago. And it says that a plurality of Americans, 48%, said they either strongly or somewhat oppose going to war with Russia to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Just 27% favoured such a move, and 24% don't know. Meanwhile, 73% said that the United States should prioritise domestic issues over foreign policy issues, and just 7% agreed that foreign policy should take precedence. In fact, there's little enthusiasm for increasing US military presence around the world. 40% of Americans polled said the United States should be less engaged, whilst only 32% said it should continue to be engaged at the same level. So only 27% of Americans polled say that the United States should be prepared to take action should either strongly or should support some move to oppose Russia in the event of a war in Ukraine. Now, 27% is nowhere near enough to build an electoral or political coalition in the United States to go to war or to get into some kind of conflict with Russia. The administration can certainly see those polling figures. So I suspect do the Republicans. I suspect that Republicans are probably even more opposed to the idea of a conflict. Republican voters are even more opposed to a conflict with Russia in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. And frankly, support for it just isn't there. So let's unpack and understand what that means. America will not go to war to defend Ukraine. NATO will not go to war to defend Ukraine. The Russians have said that they will go to war to prevent Ukraine joining NATO. And the indications are that on this issue, the Russian government has the support of the Russian people. The reason is that, as I've said previously, the Russians talk about power and security, and concepts of power and security carry traction with a population that feels or is told that a particular set of circumstances will leave it less secure, whilst, of course, concepts of honour and values carry far less traction with a American electorate that's become increasingly cynical and war weary after all the many wars that have been fought in its name and at its expense around the world. So that given that Russia is prepared to fight over NATO membership for Ukraine, but the United States and NATO and Britain are not prepared to fight Russia over Ukraine, what that means is that in reality, in fact, the whole question of Ukraine's NATO membership has been solved. It has ended. Ukraine will never join NATO because the Americans and the Europeans will not fight to ensure that it does, whereas the Russians will fight to ensure that it doesn't happen. Given that the military balance in Ukraine, as I've discussed numerous times, is decisively against Ukraine and in Russia's favor in the event of a war with Russia, that means that there is no possibility any longer of Ukraine ever joining NATO. And by the way, I'm sure the same applies to Georgia and Moldova as well. So that already tells us that though the United States finds it difficult to come out and say openly and straightforwardly that it's prepared to agree to Russia's demands about no further eastward expansion of NATO, because it is caught on its rhetorical conceit about honor and values, which mean that it can't openly say that the door to NATO membership for certain countries is closed, even though the United States finds it difficult to admit that. That is actually the reality. And then that brings us now to what is going to happen from this point on, because Putin has been giving a series of interviews to the Russian media. He's given two. They've been big interviews. Very interestingly, the Russian presidential website, the Kremlin's website, has not provided transcripts of them. And I think the reason for that is because they are so strong in their language that I think the Russians fear that if they were published in English, they might actually heighten tensions and might make it more difficult for the Americans to come to the negotiating table and to talk about things with the Russians than might otherwise be the case. But we now have learnt a number of things because, of course, even though the Kremlin won't provide us with transcripts, the Russian media is covering this topic. And I'm taking some of quotations of what Putin has said from the Russian media, now specifically from Sputnik. And this is what Sputnik quotes Putin saying in a Russian TV interview. "I've spoken about the red lines which we believe should not be crossed. I want everyone to understand here in our country and abroad, so that our partners understand. The issue isn't about the line which we don't want someone to cross. The issue is that we have nowhere to fall back to. NATO have squeezed us against such a line, pardon the expression, that we can't move around. I have already said they'll put missile systems in Ukraine, 4 to 5 minutes flight time to Moscow. Where can we move? They have simply driven us to such a state that we have to tell them stop. That's the whole point." And then Putin went on to say, they will chat endlessly, speak endlessly about the need to negotiate and do nothing except pumping up our neighbor with modern weapon systems and increase the threat to Russia, which will then be forced to somehow deal with, somehow live. It puts all the participants in the negotiation process within a certain framework. But for us, there is only one goal: to reach agreements which would ensure, both for today and over the long term, the security of Russia and its citizens. So, this is extremely strong language. It says Russia has nowhere to retreat to. It's reached that point where it has to say stop. And it's not just a question now of NATO agreeing or grudgingly accepting or saying that it won't extend into NATO, into Ukraine. It's also issues like the build-up of military weapons, NATO weapons in Ukraine itself, and of what Russia is going to do in response to all of that. And what are the Russians going to do? Well, at one level, the Russians have been talking about military technical responses. And what do they mean by this? Well, I'm going to say, and I go back now to earlier programs that I have done, I think one of the things that is driving the hard line that the Russians are taking at the moment is that their Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone is now almost ready for deployment. And I suspect that if there is no movement in these negotiations, it is going to be deployed very soon. Now, when I say deployed, as I understand it, the consensus is starting to crystallize that the possibility that this nuclear-powered drone could actually patrol the ocean independently for large periods of time, waiting to be activated by a signal from Moscow. This idea, which I previously thought might be just theoretical or fanciful, it seems that the Pentagon is starting to worry that this might be what actually might happen. So we could start to see, if there is no movement in these negotiations, that kind of military build-up in the North Atlantic, and by the way, also in the Pacific. The Russians could start to deploy Poseidon submarine drones in the North Atlantic, in the Northern Pacific, ready to strike at New York and Boston, and indeed Washington, D.C., and by the way, also against Los Angeles and San Francisco. They would be deployed and ready to strike on a signal from Moscow, and there would be no counterstep, and that would be, I suspect, extremely alarming for the United States. But I suspect that the Russians are prepared to take other measures too. Firstly, obviously, they're in a position to dominate now with hypersonic missile systems the North Atlantic region, making it more difficult for the United States to deploy ships, warships in the North Atlantic against Russia. But I have to say this, I think some of this talk from the Russians does eventually point to military action against Ukraine itself. If there is no negotiation, if there's no movement in the negotiations, then it seems to me that at some point those pressures within Russia to resolve this problem in Ukraine and the whole issue of NATO's eastward expansion once and for all through some sort of military action, those voices will become both compelling and they will prevail. I don't think this is going to happen immediately. I think that the Russians are going to wait until their financial system is made more resilient through perhaps the interconnections with China and India. And also, of course, they would be wanting to put themselves in a position where perhaps through the threat of deployment of Poseidon drones and other weapon systems, they can be confident even more confident that there would be no counter-response from the United States of a military nature. And in fact, the United States might even be wary at that point of applying some of the sanctions pressure that it has been talking about. That points, to my mind, to a time window of perhaps a year, possibly two. A year in which the Russians can further beef up their conventional forces by developing more of their new conventional weapons, their Armata tanks, for example, their Sukhoi 57 fighter jets, those kind of weapon systems, perhaps more practically, but even their S-500 and S-400 surface-to-air missiles, their new drone weapons that they're producing in ever larger quantities. And at the same time, of course, obviously, their nuclear counter-weapons, their Zircon anti-ship missiles, and of course their Poseidon submarine drones, and perhaps their Burest-Venik nuclear-powered cruise missiles. All of these weapon systems are going to mature probably in the next 2 years, and they're going to be deployed around then. And I suspect also that by that point, the Russians will have moved forward with their arrangements with China. The Power of Siberia Pipeline 2 will be, if not fully completed, well on the way to construction. There was making Russia less dependent on gas supplies to Europe for its foreign exchange. I don't think it is particularly dependent already, but still you can ensure your position even further that way. And of course, creating even more resiliency within their financial system to make the effect of a swift disconnection even less effective. So we are looking at a time window of perhaps a year, possibly two. But if there is no movement in that time, then given the rhetoric from Moscow, I suspect that at some point there will be military action taken, and it will probably center on Ukraine itself. Now, I say that this is, of course, all a guess. I can't be certain of this. I'm not familiar with Putin's own timetable, but I think that if the West thinks that it has infinite time to string these negotiations along, then I think it is going to find that it is wrong, profoundly and dangerously wrong about that, and that it would be better, therefore, given the shifting change in the military and economic balance, to come to this agreement now. I'm just going to finish by saying that the United States and NATO can agree to the essence of the Russian proposals. I accept that there may be some things that on the margins that can be talked about and negotiated round. But ultimately, an acknowledgement that NATO expansion eastward has come to a stop, and some steps to reduce some of that military footprint in Eastern Europe is the minimum that the United States has to agree to, but that if it does agree to it, we will see undoubtedly a rapid easing of tensions in Europe. And I suspect at that point, by the way, with the prospect of NATO membership and probably EU membership gone forever, we will actually see moves towards a settlement of the situation within Ukraine itself. The conflict there will have lost its point, and I suspect that the power brokers within Ukraine will at that point decide that there's no sense in sustaining this quarrel. It's better to come to terms. So 1 to 2 years, I might be actually erring on the generous side. If you listen to some of Putin's statements, he perhaps gives the impression that the time frame is shorter still. I don't personally think that, but I certainly don't think there is infinite time, and I think that 1 to 2 years is probably the maximum amount of time before these Russian demands that we really have been hearing about really do become an ultimatum with the real possibility of military action if they're not complied with. Anyway, thank you again for joining me today. I hope this wraps up this discussion on this topic, at least for the moment. More from me soon. Enjoy your holiday. Check us out on Locals. Check us out also on our other platforms. Go to our shop. Support us via PayPal, Subscribestar. Check your subscription. Tick the like button. And thank you again for joining me today. And enjoy your Christmas and your holiday. Speak to you soon.